This is the Cato Daily Podcast for Thursday, March 26, 2020. I'm Caleb Brown. The civil liberties implications of a pandemic are hard to overstate. Governors ordering the closure of businesses, imposing restrictions on the kinds of activities people can share with each other, and of course, federal law enforcers seeking special powers. However much these actions might make sense over a brief time period, how best to keep them from becoming a long-term ratcheting up of government authority? Cato's Patrick Eddington comments. I've seen a lot of police departments talking about what they won't be responding to in the coming weeks, and some of those are, certain fender benders, certain kinds of mistreatment, of intentional mistreatment of one another that they won't be responding to. And yet on the flip side, the feds, you see a lot of move to get emergency powers. So what do you make of those efforts so far? And do any of them make sense to you?
Well, I don't think there's any question that, the stay-at-home orders and all the rest of that, given the nature of the virus right now, are clearly steps that actually need to be taken. And I think it's a good news story that we're seeing, as you indicated, police departments and other law enforcement-related entities basically saying they're not going to enforce what some are referring to as quality of life crimes or, things of that nature. I think that's great. What has me deeply concerned, quite frankly, is this Politico piece that ran on March 24th by Josh Gerstein, the headline of which is, "Those who intentionally spread coronavirus could be charged as terrorists." The subhead, "The Justice Department offers guidance on how to deal with, quote, purposeful exposure and infection of others," end quote. And they're clearly, drawing on war on terror language and experience here. And the Politico piece goes on to quote uh, a memo that was sent out by Deputy Attorney General Jeff Rosen to U.S. attorneys across the country. Quote, "Because coronavirus appears to meet the statutory definition of a, quote, biological agent," end quote, "such acts potentially could implicate the nation's terrorism-related statutes. Threats or attempts to use COVID-19 as a weapon against Americans will not be tolerated." So, if a guy were to go into a supermarket, for example, and knew he was infected and started, opening up ice cream and licking it and then putting it back and all the rest of that, should that guy be taken into custody and charged with endangering public health? Yes. Is he a terrorist? Probably not. Definitely a jerk, but I don't I don't think a terrorist in that respect. And this is what bothers me about this language and this approach is that they're trying to classify COVID-19 essentially as a biological agent, a biological weapon, if you will. And we don't have any evidence that it is in fact that. The evidence we have tells us that it's in the same family essentially as SARS and MERS, just essentially a variant of that. Those were absolutely, unfortunately, relatively naturally occurring. Certainly not bioengineered in a biolevel 4 hazard lab in China or Russia or anywhere else, so far as or the United States, so far as we know. So I think, again, this is DOJ, hair on fire, war on terror mentality, just kind of out of control. And it's exactly the kind of thing that we need lawmakers to speak out and say, dead on arrival.
So Israel has passed an emergency law to use mobile phone data to track people infected with COVID-19. And there is at least some indication, there is some interest at certain levels of government to do that in the United States.
And I worry about the ideas, usually very bad ideas, that our Israeli friends wind up giving our folks in the intelligence and law enforcement community. And that is certainly one of them. I mean, this is obviously a technology that we know has already been used to keep track of Americans. The scooping up of their cell phone data, of course, their telephone-related data is what Edward Snowden exposed. Coming up this June, it'll actually be 7 years now. It's kind of hard to believe it's been that long. But we've known at this point for at least 15 years that this technology exists and it is absolutely ripe for being misused. And again, this is a classic example of where I think some people with relatively good intentions are not thinking through the long-term implications of exactly how this technology can be misused. We're already beginning to see, I think, in the UK, where they're utilizing facial recognition to try to. I think also the Russians are doing this, using facial recognition to spot people who are not complying with stay-at-home directives or whatever. And this is exactly how you wind up getting literally a panopticon type police state. And just because you're going to use it in this particular emergency doesn't mean you won't use it in another one. I think it's important. You and I had talked about this Damon Root piece in Reason earlier this week, where Damon talked about the fact that when you have an emergency, and this is something that Robert Higgs, the economist, he wrote an entire book about, Crisis in Leviathan, whereby every time there is a crisis, government uses it as an opportunity to expand. In Higgs' context, it was about the economic expansion, the power of the state economically expanding. But he also touches, on the implications of this from a security standpoint, a liberty standpoint, and this is what Damon really picked up on. The passage of the Espionage Act in 1917, a radically overbroad statute with very, very squishy language that was, of course, directly used to shut down newspapers in this country that were opposed to the war. One newspaper publisher, first socialist congressman, in fact, Victor Berger of Wisconsin, wound up having to deal with this and be charged with espionage, and that case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court made the wrong decision in it, and that's why we have to be concerned. Once these things get passed, it's rare that they get rolled back. There was very limited rollback of some of these radical World War I measures, such as the Sedition Act, that was rolled back in 1921. But the Espionage Act and the Trading with the Enemy Act remained on the books. And I think what we're seeing now, of course, is with the Patriot Act passed in 2001. This October will be 19 years that thing has been on the books, which basically makes it all but permanent, right? And that alters the fundamental character of this country.
We spoke last week about surveillance authorities that were set to expire, and they did.
Yeah, yeah, it's really interesting, this whole hair on fire business in the March 13th period, where folks are basically saying, well, we've got to renew these three expiring authorities, or essentially people are going to die. And the Senate, wound up having to reach a compromise measure where the terrible bill that came out of the House was essentially dead on arrival in the Senate. And so folks agreed to a 77-day extension, which did actually pass the Senate over that particular weekend. But as of today, so far as I can tell, that measure is still, quote, at the desk in the House of Representatives, which means, that the House has not acted on it as yet. And that means essentially that those three authorities, quote, expired, end quote. Now, the reality is, as Senator Burr kind of gave away the game here during the debate on all this stuff over a week ago, under Executive Order 12333, essentially the executive branch can basically continue to do this stuff, and they can do it basically without any kind of court review. So the idea that, they don't have the emergency authorities to do this stuff, or that the expiration of the roving wiretap thing is going to, lead to a disaster, those have always been hype. We're seeing right now that they're hype. If they really had, something to go on here, where they actually had a real crisis, we would be hearing about that at least as much as we are the COVID-19 crisis, and we simply aren't. And that's how we know that, again, this is a scam. It's a game.
Attorney General Barr seems set to assume that courts are largely unable to do a lot of the work that they have been doing, and would like the ability to detain people for some period of time that is indefinite, while this COVID-19 crisis hopefully wears itself out.
And I think, this is very much something that we need to be concerned about with respect to basically telling federal judges, if this crisis makes it difficult or impossible for you to actually have, in-person court meetings, you can go ahead and just kind of put those off until you're essentially in the clear. And the original reporting on this that Politico gave us was that this stuff, might last as much as a year beyond, the stated end of the crisis. And of course, my question is, well, exactly who decides when the crisis is over? Is this a presidential proclamation that starts it, and do we have to have a presidential proclamation to end it, et cetera, et cetera? And we've seen, this kind of game before, where we have to have a national emergency over this or that, and then the so-called national emergency never goes away. And I think there's been enough reaction so far to this Barr proposal by some very prominent folks in Congress, including Senator Paul, Senator Schumer, and others, that the likelihood of them actually getting away with this is probably minimal. But that's why I think we have to be vigilant about this $2 trillion, let's print some more money, coronavirus response package, to make sure that they're not trying to slip stuff in there along these lines. It would certainly not be the first time that that's been done, and it probably won't be the last, but I think we need to be very vigilant about that.
So let's assume that Congress moves ahead with some sort of restriction that causes you and me to drop our jaws. And what must be in there in order to give you any kind of peace at all?
An absolute firm date for the suspension of said authorities. I would say that we had the initial guidance come out of the CDC that folks should basically stay in place for a couple of months, 8 weeks or so. As far as I'm concerned, if it doesn't have a firm expiration date in it, and I'm not talking about any carve outs here either, because we can see language like shall expire on 60 days after, comma, unless the president certifies in writing that ... That's the kind of language that we could never agree to. We should never agree to. And if we have language like that in there, then that is absolutely a prescription for the kind of radically increased population control that I think all of us are deeply concerned about this kind of crisis can actually lead us to.
Patrick Eddington is a research fellow at the Cato Institute. You can subscribe to the Cato Daily Podcast wherever you please, and follow us on Twitter @Cato Podcast.